Hey, I have a really simple video here that I want to show. Hopefully it won't take too long, but one of the things I see students struggle with is the ability to test to have an integration test or a feature test through RSpec that is using like fetch calls or has JavaScript being executed. Here's a really simple example of what I'm talking about. So I have a link here on this page, and when I click the link, I get this data that shows up, the name and email address. I know this is not super cool, but I think it'll illustrate the point. What's happening here is we're using JavaScript to make a fetch call to an API endpoint and then inserting that data onto the page. So here, for example, is the data the API endpoint that's being hit from fetch. So the fetch call goes here, and then it takes this data and inserts it onto the page. Nothing too complex. Let me show you the code that's happening first here to make this happen. So you'll see that we've got this link that's reveal user data. And the user card, which is an empty div right now, is this place where this name and email will be inserted into. So let's look at the JavaScript that's making this happen. And this is raw JavaScript. There's no libraries or anything that's being used here. We could totally clean this up by using some external library. So don't worry too much about the code that's here. You probably can do this better. But I think the idea behind this video, I think this serves its purpose. So basically what's happening is we're saying, hey, when we click on an A tag, we're going to assign that to a variable. And when it's clicked on, we're going to prevent default, and which would typically like reload the page or take it to a different page. And then we're going to call this function called retrieve user data. Retrieve user data is where the fetch call happens. So we're going to go out, hit this API endpoint. We're going to take that, turn it into something we can use, and call user.name, user.email, but we're going to pass it into this other function called user card. So user card is just a function that returns some HTML, and it uses some string interpolation to insert the email address and the name. And then back on line 18 here, it will take that HTML and we're going to set it for the user card on the page. Nothing too fancy, pretty basic stuff. However, testing this through Rails and through RSpec and Capybara can be pretty tricky if you've never done it before. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to pull up my feature test, and really all that's happening on my feature test here is we're creating a user, and then we're visiting the root page. We click on the link reveal user data, and we're expecting it to have this content show up on the page. Right now, when I run this test, it should fail. And what we see happening is that it says that it expected to find text Arthur Vandelay in reveal user data. So it is not working. And however, when we go to the browser and we test it out, it sure seems like it's working, right? The reason this is that out of the box, Capybara cannot execute JavaScript. And we have to configure it to be able to run a browser of some sort that can execute the JavaScript. I'm going to set this up to use Chrome, but there are other options. There's like headless browsers, which typically run a little bit faster. I think if this is your first time trying to do this, that I recommend using something like Chrome. Heads up, there can be some difficulty configuring Firefox, so I would try to start with Chrome first. I think it's the least likely to cause you problems. There are some other tools if you're interested in. There are headless versions of Chrome, and I think there's also things like Poltergeist and Phantom.js, which might be kind of cool to play around with later, which are headless versions which run pretty fast, and they're also pretty popular. But this is an easier setup to start with, and this is what I'm going to go with for now. All right, so where do we start? The first step is that we have to tell Capybara that we want to execute JavaScript. We do that by passing in a key here that will say JS. Older versions of Capybara would require us to do something like this, where we'd say JS true. So if you're using an older version, you might have to do this. But I'm using a newer version that will support this syntax here. If I run this test now, we should get an error related to Selenium. Yeah, there we go. Cool. So if we look, by switching that flag on, you'll see that it triggers this error that says Capybara's Selenium driver is unable to load Selenium WebDriver. Please install the gem and add gem Selenium WebDriver to your gem file if you are using Bundler. Cool. So let's do that. Selenium is a way to interface with external browsers, and it's a way to like add some additional functionality to Capybara. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to open up my gem file, and you'll see that I have Selenium WebDriver commented out. I'm just going to go ahead and uncomment that line, and I'm going to run bundle. All right, bundle is complete. Let's go ahead and go back to our feature test and run it again. And hopefully we see something different. All right, now this time we see that it's unable to find Mozilla Gecko driver. Please download the server from, okay. What this is telling us is that by default, Selenium is configured to work with Mozilla Gecko driver. That's not what we're using here. We're going to try to use Chrome instead. So we have to go configure it to use that. The first step in the configuration here is that we'll go back to our gem file, and we're going to add the gem for Chrome driver helper. Go ahead and bundle. And this is not going to be enough. If I go and I run that test again, you'll see that it still fails for the same reason, unable to find Mozilla Gecko driver, right? So we've installed the gem, but we haven't told it to use this gem yet. So we got to make sure we do that next. I'm going to do this inside of the Rails helper. There's probably, you could probably extract this out into a separate file, which is probably a little bit better, but I'm just going to do this for the sake of simplicity. I will paste it right here. So I've got this configuration that I like to use, which basically tells Selenium that we want to use the Chrome browser. And we tell it that we want to use Selenium Chrome for running JavaScript. And this configuration is kind of cool, and you maybe haven't seen it yet. By default, I think the default max wait time within Capybara is set to like 2 seconds, I believe. This allows us to up it a little bit in case there's some like JavaScript that takes a little bit longer. So Capybara will kind of like keep trying up until like 5 seconds in, and then it's gonna like stop. You can tweak this number if you think that there's like some JavaScript that's taking a while to execute. You could up it to like 10 seconds or something like that and just see what happens. This is a little better than doing like sleeps and stuff like that, because this will pass as soon as it gets what it needs. It'll like move on. So you're not gonna like, it's not gonna be 5 seconds every time. It's going to be like up until we hit 5 seconds, then we'll move on. And then we just set the default driver to be Selenium. All right, so let's run our test again and see if we see a different error, or maybe no error at all. Hey, check it out. You'll see that it passed. And I don't know if you noticed, but it actually opened up Chrome to run that. So let me go back to our feature test, and I want to just show you how that happens. I'm going to put a, maybe I could put a debugger in here maybe, or I could put a sleep. Let me try putting a debugger and see if this gets us what we want. See if it gets us to pause the browser while it's running, and I think it did. Yeah, so you'll see that this is where our test suite is actually running its expectations against, and you can see the data show up on the page. So one of the things I like about using like a real browser, like a non-headless browser, I should say, in scenarios like if you're first starting to use this, is that you can interact with it and actually pause your test suite in the middle and see what's showing up on the page, which is pretty cool. I have a preference in general for a headless browser just because it's a little bit faster, but there are some times where this is like kind of nice to have. So I think if you're starting out, this is a great way to start out. And if I hit continue, it should close out that browser. Yeah, and then it passes and we're good. One thing we haven't talked about that might trip you up is if you're using Database Cleaner. This configuration that I've shown right here works great until you start using transactions within your database cleaner. Let's talk about why that is. So first of all, on the database cleaner documentation, there's a section there for RSpec with Capybara, and there's an example of a configuration for it. We're going to take this snippet here and paste it into our code base, but first I want to talk about what's happening here. By default, inside of your RSpec configure block, use transactional fixtures is going to be set to true. In order to get this all to work, we have to set this to false, so don't forget to change the setting. One nice thing about this particular snippet is that it checks to see if we've set that correctly for this to work. And if we haven't, it's going to raise a message here, and it's not going to actually run through the code. Typically, when you use Database Cleaner, most people end up using transactions most of the time. This is because it prevents IDs from incrementing up in the database, and I think it tends to be a little bit faster as well. However, there's a downside to this when we start using JavaScript. If we look at this test here that we're using, on line 5, we create a user in the database. If this is a transaction, this user will be available within this test, but from the outside world, like let's say through the Chrome browser, like we're trying to set up here, that browser will not have access to this user in the database because it shares a different thread, and the actual insertion of this data, because it's in a transaction, has not really persisted. So Chrome, if we're visiting the same database, hitting the same database from Chrome, it's not going to be able to see it. So what we need to do is we need to change that to truncation in certain scenarios. And you'll notice that that happens right here in this snippet, where we set the database cleaner strategy to truncation. The check that's happening is that it wants to check basically before any feature test that we run. It's going to check and see if Capybara's current driver is set to rack test. If it's set to rack test, then we're probably fine, and we could just kind of continue forward with a transaction. However, if the current driver is not rack test, and in our case it's going to be we're using Chrome, then we're going to switch the strategy to truncation. And that should be enough to kind of get things working for us. So let's go ahead and grab all of this entire snippet here. And I'm going to take that into my Rails helper. And that's going to have to go inside of this block here. Notice line 44 here has this use transactional fixture set to true. I just have to make sure I change that. Get rid of that line. Let's see. Oops, I went a little too far up. All right. So let's get rid of this line. Clean that up a bit. Okay, cool. So we got that set to false. Looks good here. Just double checking everything we have. And I think we should be good to go. All right, so let me just make sure that my test suite still runs, or this test still runs. We don't really have any other tests other than this one. All right. Oh, right. We didn't install database cleaner, so it says uninitialized constant database cleaner. So let's go to the gem file. That's kind of important. And I'll bundle. Come back to the test and run it. All right, and now we're back to green. What I want to show you next is if we go to the Rails helper and I change this strategy to transaction, it's going to fail. And I'll go back to our feature test, run it. Right, and so like you'll see it still opened up the browser, it checked for everything, but now you'll see that it fails because it's not able to find Arthur Vandelay in reveal user data. this reveal user data here on line 12 of the error that's down below is this is just the link. So the only thing that's showing up on this page right now is the link. We're not seeing any of the other content there. Again, the reason this happened is that we switched from using a truncation strategy to a transaction strategy. So we'll just change this back to truncation. And when I run the test again, we should be back to green. And there we go. I hope this is useful. Again, there's other setups that you could use where maybe you're not like actually inserting data into the database. Maybe you're using mocks and stubs, that sort of thing. But don't worry too much about like overcomplicating things yet. I think this is a good starting point. And as you get more comfortable with this, I think you'll find its limitations naturally, and you'll be able to kind of find different solutions that you could use. But I think this is a great starting point if you're just getting into writing tests around JavaScript and fetch calls and for integration tests and stuff like that. Hope this is useful. Thanks a lot. Bye.